In truth, the campaign against the Soviet Union was more than a roundabout route to defeat Britain. It was an object for war in its own right, not only to remove a major threat to German empire building in Eastern Europe, but to form the future site of a Eurasian empire ruled from Berlin. The initial idea in 1940 for a campaign against the Red Army came from the German army leadership in early July, who were keen to deliver a punitive blow to keep the Soviet Union at arm's length and safeguard the eastern border. It was Hitler who turned this suggestion into a grander plan, announced on 31st July to military leaders to annihilate the Soviet state before it was too late. The Soviet moves into the Baltic states and Romania were a clear threat. German intelligence could detect the Soviet moves to fortify and garrison the new western frontier with German occupied Poland, the so called Molotov Line, while Soviet air bases moved closer to the border in range of Berlin. After Molotov's visit in November 1940, Hitler indicated that the Soviet Union should be destroyed as soon as possible, since Stalin's appetite appeared unappeasable. The most dangerous scenario was a simultaneous assault from an Anglo American alliance in the west and a Soviet strike from the east. The Führer's great anxiety, recalled von Ribbentrop in his memoirs, was for Germany to be drawn into a gigantic two-front war which would cause great destruction of life and property. The imponderable nature of the current strategic situation made a rapid defeat of the Soviet Union seem militarily rational. On 30 March 1941, in a speech lasting 2.5 hours to all the commanders involved in the coming campaign, Hitler pronounced that the destruction of the Soviet state would rid Germany of the Russian Asian threat for all time. This was a conflict with which German commanders were happy to identify, whatever misgivings they might have about its feasibility. Hitler's contention that the Russians would seize the first favorable moment to attack us, recalled Albert Kesserling, commander of Air Fleet 2 for the invasion, seemed to be indisputably right. It was of the greatest importance, he added, to keep communism away from Western Europe, an attitude that would not be out of place 10 years later at the height of the Cold War. One question the German military commanders seem not to have considered seriously, even as they accepted the strategic necessity of a German Soviet war, was what the conquest of the vast Eurasian territory was ultimately for. Underlying all Hitler's arguments that he was compelled by circumstances to wage war was his understanding that conquest would produce the ultimate German empire, vast in scale and potentially unassailable by the maritime great powers. Hitler was more reticent in his reviews of strategy about the naked imperialism that the seizure of further Lebensraum involved. But during a lengthy meeting on 9 January 1941 with his generals, he reminded them of the immeasurable riches in materials and land that would fall into German hands. Once the empire stretched far into Russia, he continued, Germany will have all means possible for waging wars against continents. Conquest of the area designated by Hitler in August the previous year, from Archangel in the north to Astrakhan in the far south, would give Germans the territory they deserved to be carved out from Mackinder's world island. This space in Russia, Hitler told his circle a few months later, must always be dominated by Germans. This was the apotheosis of the decades long German fantasy of the East as imperial space. Each of these motives reinforced the others, creating for Hitler a lethal cocktail of justifications for action. But the prize was a German Eurasian empire scarcely imaginable 2 years before. While his decision slowly solidified between July and December 1940, the armed forces undertook the detailed planning. The final document, prepared for Hitler to approve or correct in mid December, was based on two major studies carried out by the army and by Hitler's headquarters. The first study, undertaken by Major General Erich Marx, was completed by August. He suggested two axes of assault, one towards Leningrad, one to capture the industry of Ukraine, before swinging south and north to encircle Moscow. Marx was privately pessimistic about a campaign whose terminal objectives stretched from Archangel to the Volga, and one that might provoke a larger war against the United States as well, but his doubts never reached Hitler. The second study was prepared by Lieutenant Colonel Bernhard von Lossberg on instructions from Hitler's headquarters. Completed in mid September, the Lossberg plan anticipated three separate thrusts: one to the north to capture the Baltic ports needed for supply, one in the center with the bulk of the armored and motorized divisions intended to capture Moscow, and one in the south, fanning out to occupy Odessa and the Black Sea coast, as well as the rich resources of Ukraine, all to be completed in one campaigning season. The final draft, drawing from both plans, was presented to Hitler on 5 December, after he had used the Molotov visit as confirmation that destiny was calling him to eliminate Russia, which will always, whenever possible, stand in Germany's path. The three-pronged attack was the preferred option, but Hitler wanted to concentrate on capturing Leningrad and the resources of Ukraine first, before moving on Moscow. Jodl, his chief of operations, accordingly modified the draft directive, although Halder and the army leadership privately hoped to retain Moscow as the main axis. On 18 December, Hitler signed War Directive number 21 for an operation that he had decided to title Barbarossa, after the red-bearded Holy Roman Emperor who had led the 12th century Third Crusade to the Holy Land.